May the peace of Jesus be with us all this evening. Good evening to everybody. I'm Art Laffin, and on behalf of Nick Mealy and Ronnie Fellerath Lowell, Edward Oblen, and the Pax Christi staff, I'd like to welcome everyone to session 2 of the Gospel and Nuclear Disarmament Study Circle. Last week, we were blessed to have 2 outstanding presentations by John Deere and Molly Rush, who helped amplify the themes of the session, Who is Jesus? And the corresponding appendix piece, The Courage to Start by Bob Aldridge. Edward has now posted these on the Pax Christi website, Gospel and Nuclear Disarmament Study Circle link. And I encourage you to share this wide and far with your local Pax Christi groups and parish communities that you are part of. I'd also like to thank everyone who attended last week's session and say how grateful we are for your involvement. As we are doing these study circles for the first time, we are still learning as we go and how to best maximize the short amount of time we have together to reflect on and share about the risk of the cross. So I want to express my deep appreciation to everyone who is participating in this study circle for your understanding and patience as we proceed in these sessions. The theme for tonight's session 2 is the journey of discipleship, in the corresponding appendix section, the history of the nuclear age. I hope everyone has had a chance to read the discussion article for session 2 and review the entire corresponding appendix 2. We are blessed to have with us tonight our special guest speakers and animators who will help amplify the theme of session 2. Jim and Shelley Douglas and Joe Gerson, whom you will soon hear from. As we enter into tonight's session, let us call into our presence the holy cloud of witnesses. Let us remember all the victims of nuclearism, war, violence, and oppression. Let us remember too those who have disappeared at the US-Mexico border. Today, Pax Christi and other groups sponsored a powerful press briefing across from the US Capitol of the courageous caravan of mothers of the disappeared migrants from Central America who are searching for their relatives. For tonight's session, I would like to share 2 quotes that are in the book that are connected to this session's theme. The first quote is from Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen, the late Archbishop of Seattle and close friend of Jim and Shelley. And the quote's found on page 94 and 95 of the book. Archbishop Hunthausen says, quote, "We need to find our way back to the way of nonviolence, which Jesus calls us to in the gospel and on the cross. God calls us to name the evil our society has embraced so wholeheartedly in our nuclear arms, and to do so clearly. Trident is the Auschwitz of Puget Sound because of the massive cooperation required in our area, the enormous sinful complicity that is necessary for the eventual incineration of millions of our brothers and sisters. I say with deep sorrow that our nuclear war preparations are the global crucifixion of Jesus. Our nuclear weapons are the final crucifixion of Jesus in the extermination of the human family with whom he has won. We have to refuse to give incense in our day, tax dollars, to our nuclear idol. I think the teachings of Jesus tells us to render to a nuclear armed Caesar what the Caesar deserves, tax resistance. Some would call what I'm urging civil disobedience. I prefer to see it as obedience to God." And this quote can be found in the book, A Disarming Spirit, The Life of Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen by Frank Fromherz. And the excerpt is from a speech at Pacific Lutheran University, Tacoma, Washington, June 12, 1981. In 1982, Archbishop Hunthausen's tax resistance prompted the IRS to garnish his wages. And this quote is from an article titled "Living at the End of the World" that Jim wrote which appeared in the January-February 1979 issue of Fellowship magazine and is on page 96 in The Risk of the Cross. Quote, faith is the believing that there is hope for our world. Despair is denying that our nuclear war systems can be stopped or changed. Faith is a commitment to the world's transformation through God to a kingdom of justice and peace. Never before has our despair at changing institutions threatened the extinction of all life on earth. Faith is belief in a reality, in a transformation through which it is possible for us to live deeply enough to choose new life rather than nuclear death. A lived faith will stop the bomb. We need to join in a community committed to that nonviolent life force, which is the power of the powerless. We need to test the truth by betting our lives on it in the world. If a community can experiment deeply enough in a nonviolent life force, the power of the Pentagon will crumble. And Jim, I often think of that remark every week when I vigil at the Pentagon with our Dorothy Day Catholic worker. I like to end with a quote from several quotes from Shelley. The first quote is taken from Mary House Catholic Worker newsletter, the Magnificat, back in January 2013. Quote, Peter Moore used to say that the message of the gospel is dynamite, cloaked and hidden by theological language. For him, a new evangelization would be to uncover the social teaching of the church and put it into practice. For Dorothy and for Peter, evangelization was to begin to live the good news themselves by practicing the works of mercy in daily life. For Jesus, the good news was simple. The kingdom of God is at hand. Change your lives and live as though it were true. We live in a time of state-sanctioned killing, and yet another execution is on the horizon. In light of the scheduled execution this Thursday in Alabama of Willie Smith III, who is developmentally disabled, this is a quote from Shelley's article, "Don't write off a life, no matter how easy it might be to do so," that was published in the Birmingham News, November 18th, 2007. Quote, I believe it is wrong for us to kill anyone, even if that person has killed someone. I believe all human life is sacred, made in God's image, and that we do not have the right to take any life. Human beings cannot erase the evil they have done, but with God's help, they can overcome the evil in themselves and in others with good. We should not allow our own hard-heartedness to blind us to God's mercy. And we pray, God, that this execution doesn't happen. Ronnie will now lead us in opening prayer and focus statement for tonight's session.
Let us pray. Dearest Jesus, you ask us to journey with you to the heart of fidelity, the cross. Accept our desire to follow you and help us overcome our residual fears of following in your path of ultimate service and sacrifice. Like Peter, we long to boldly confess you before our brothers and sisters in this world. But too often we share his blindness and resistance to the cross. Empower us to take risks of faith for your sake and for the gospel. To risk laying down our lives of destruction in the belief that you will not leave us in death, but will raise us to new life. In disarming our hearts of fear, arrogance, and the need, Empower us to take the risks of faith for your sake and for the gospel, to risk laying down our lives and our instruments of destruction in the belief that you will not leave us in death, but will raise us to new life. In disarming our hearts of fear, arrogance, and the need to lord it over others, may we come to that trusting openness that sees you in every child of God and rejoices to welcome you there. In welcoming you in our midst now, may we grow more like you and learn from you what it means to take up the cross and follow in your steps. This we pray and struggle. Remember your mercy. Amen. Let us now consider our focus statement for session 2, the journey of discipleship. For Jesus, the primary condition of discipleship is to take up the cross and follow in my steps. For Mark, the journey of discipleship requires a conversion from blindness to sight. The evangelist's account of Jesus's journey to Jerusalem not only contains the basic instruction for true discipleship, but also emphasizes the blindness and resistance of the disciples to the mission and cross of Jesus. Mark emphasizes the disciples' spiritual blindness by enclosing the narrative of the 3 passion predictions with 2 stories of blind men being healed: the blind man at Bethsaida and the story of Bartimaeus. It is their faith in Jesus that enable his healing power to affect them. Their blindness and cure stand in relief to the symbolic blindness of the disciples who reject the efficacy of the cross. In our age, we too struggle with the problem of often failing to grasp the significance of Jesus's mission. The very existence of nuclear weapons is a profound manifestation of our own moral and spiritual blindness. One's intention to use these weapons of mass destruction fully contradicts Jesus's teachings and his suffering and death on the cross. To confront this nuclear intention as people of faith is to expose, confess, and overcome this evil. Now I'll turn it back to Art to introduce our guest speakers.
Well, it's a great honor for me to introduce Shelley and Jim Douglas. Jim and Shelley are longtime friends and known to many in peace and justice circles for their decades-long work for nonviolence, peace, and social justice. Along with their good friend Bob Aldridge, they helped to form the original Pacific Life community and are co-founders of the Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action in Kitsap, Washington. In their book, Dear Gandhi, What Now?, that was written in 1988, they write, quote, 9 people came together to form Ground Zero Center for Nonviolent Action. Ground Zero, a piece of land sharing 330 feet of barbed wire fence with a trident base, gave us the opportunity to have a continuous nonviolent presence in the county and to form friendships with those whose work we resisted. We made the down payment on Ground Zero property in 1977, committing ourselves to a long-term presence in this Navy-dominated area. We wanted to experiment with Gandhi's idea that the enemy has a piece of the truth, and with a religious teaching of love for the enemy. We wanted to learn to walk the fine line between hating the sin and loving the sinner, recognizing that we too were complicit in violence and thus also sinners. They also helped build a community of resistance that spanned 250 towns and cities along the railroad tracks traveled by the white train, which transported nuclear weapons to the base. Living in a house so close to the tracks that it shook with each passing train, Jim and Shelley vigiled at the base, engaged their neighbors who worked there in serious and respectful dialogue, and went to jail repeatedly for acts of nonviolent witness at the base. It was during this time that I first met Shelley and Jim and was immediately inspired by their life together and their exemplary commitment to gospel nonviolence. In 1988, they moved to Birmingham, Alabama, and founded Mary's House Catholic Worker in 1993. In 1966, Jim's landmark book, The Nonviolent Cross, was published, and since then he has authored 5 other outstanding books, which, if you haven't done so already, I encourage you all to read them. In 2008, he wrote JFK and the Unspeakable: Why He Died and Why It Matters, which is a must-read for people who want to know the truth about the Kennedy assassination. All of Jim's books are must-read books. Jim is currently working on a book about the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and RFK. Jim and Shelley were given the Pachman Terrace Award in 1997 and are both Teachers of Peace awarded by Pax Christi USA. Shelley and Jim, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Okay, thank you for inviting us. We're the kind of people that when somebody mentions our names, somebody else will say, oh, are they still alive? So we're glad to prove that we're still alive. We decided that I would start off, and I wanted to just say that I go through various phases in my life. Sometimes I'm very much into theological language, and sometimes I'm not. And right now, I'm not. But what I'm trying to understand, if we're serious about talking about nonviolence, it has to be something that's not only understood in our own religious terms, it has to be something that can be understood by everybody, any religion or no religion. And so I've been reading and thinking about, well, what are the signs, what are the marks of a nonviolent life? And I don't know if many people on here know Bob Mott. Bob is an ex-Jesuit who is now really a Buddhist monk who walks all over Cambodia and lives with and serves people who have AIDS and or have other terrible illnesses in Cambodia in the villages. And he sent me a copy of a speech that he wrote for a friend of his. He said, this is the speech that was never delivered. It is now promised to go into a book, which will probably never be published. So I'm reading you a little bit of this undelivered and not to be published speech. He's talking about Buddha. This man is a Buddhist, and the speech was to be given in Rome to a gathering of religious working for peace. He says, there's a famous conversation between the Lord Buddha and one of his beloved disciples, Ananda. He said to the Buddha, this is the half of the holy life, blessed one, admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie. But then the Buddha replied, don't say that, Ananda, don't say that. Admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie are actually the whole of the holy life. So being being disciples and walking together is how we learn to do this. And Gosananda, who is the teacher of Bob Mott, was a man who walked for peace. He did peace walks all over Cambodia at the end of the war and on. And he said that the only way people will understand what we're doing is if we can tell them stories. Stories are what express our theology. He says a concrete example, this is one thing Gosananda did. At one time in Cambodia, people were afraid that more landmines were in the ground than there were feet to walk upon them. It was a land littered with landmines, a legacy of the war that Cambodia is still dealing with today. Maha Gosananda would halt the Peace Walks procession whenever the walkers passed a D miners team alongside the road. He would give them a special water blessing and then teaching to the walkers. He would proclaim that these D miners are the bodhisattvas of Cambodia today. They risk their lives to prevent the suffering of others, human and beast. And then he would say, the mother of the landmines in the ground is the landmines of our own hearts, greed, hatred, and delusion. If Cambodia is ever to have peace, we must demine our own hearts first. Now that strikes a chord for me because when we began the Pacific Life community back in the olden days, we used to talk about the tridents within and how we are complicit in the building of these nuclear weapons as long as we profit in any way from what they do, which is to defend the American empire. So we have been trying to walk with friends for quite a long time on this road, and I'm assigned to talk about Bob Alders, so I'll talk about him. He was one of our early friends on the road. We were living in Hawaii in the early 70s, and we had a little group called Catholic Action of Hawaii, spelled with a small C, so it could be inclusive. And we met and we would vigil and we would give out leaflets. We were working against the war in Vietnam. And one day we had visits from young airmen, young men in the Air Force who came to our Catholic Action meeting and said, we need your help. And we were like, what do you mean you need our help? These young men knowingly were targeting schools and hospitals in Vietnam. And they felt that because they were in the military, they were under orders and they couldn't do anything about it. But they said to us, you aren't in the military and we're telling you, and you can get this information out. So Catholic Action created a campaign, a 40-day Lenten campaign of leafleting and civil disobedience at Hickam Air Force Base on the word of these young airmen who had consciences. And as part of that campaign, there were a lot of different things done. Well, I won't go into what was done. There were too many things, but one of the things that was done is that Jim Douglas and Jim Albertini, who is still in Hawaii, still resisting, were able to go into the command center of the base, and they had baby bottles of our blood in their briefcases. They went in to deliver a letter to the commander. And when the sergeant who had met them left them in an office to deliver the letter, they noticed that some file cabinets were open, and they took the blood and they poured it on the documents in the file cabinets. And out of that, it was a long, complicated process, but they had felony charges leveled against them with a 10-year possible sentence and, I don't know, big fine. And so there was a big trial. And it turned out that the charges were lowered because they happened to pour the blood on files that talked about the use of anti-personnel weapons in Vietnam. And the government didn't want to admit that. So in order not to bring the evidence into court, they lowered the charges. If it's a misdemeanor, you don't have to provide the evidence. But there was still a trial, and it was a big trial. Dan Berrigan came to support us, several international lawyers, Mary Kaufman, and this man named Bob Alders, whom we'd never met. he came to make a statement of support from the National Association of Laity. And he was on the stage the same night that Dan read poetry, I think. And one of the international lawyers talked about war crimes and how what we were doing in Vietnam with anti-personnel weapons was like what was done by the Nazis in terms of destruction of civilian human beings. And when it was Bob's turn to get up and read his statement, he got up. He didn't say anything. And we just thought, this is a really shy man. We didn't know much of anything about him. And that was it. We eventually, again, long, complicated story, we wound up moving back to Canada. And while we were living in Canada, we had a call from Bob saying he'd like to come and visit us. So he came to visit us in our little house in the mountains of Canada, up above Vancouver. And he told us this amazing story, which you can read in your background material there, about how his family went away at Advent, 10 kids. Youngest, I think Mark was 4 at that point. The oldest ones were in college. They went away and decided that he should quit his job because his job was to design the reentry vehicles for the Trident missiles. So we were very moved by this. Here's a person of conscience who is doing something amazing, a whole family making this decision. And as we were sitting there being moved, he looked at us and he said, "And do you know where the Trident will be home ported?" And we were like, "No, we never heard of the Trident." It turned out it was going to be home ported in Kitsap County, Washington, which was about maybe a 4-hour drive from our house in the mountains. And he kind of handed this over to us. He told us this very moving story about his response to the issue. And then he said, "Okay, your turn." So we were part of a group along a very loosely knit group of resistors along the Pacific coast who were tired of resisting. We were very tired of resisting. We had gone through the Vietnam War. We had done our best. We had succeeded to some extent. We were part of what stopped it. But we had not treated each other with care, and we had not dealt with any of the deeper issues. Why was this empire in Vietnam? What were we trying to do? We were just trying to stop the war. And we were all burned out, partly because of just trying to stop the war, and nothing else. But we felt compelled, and so we called a meeting. Maybe 20, 25 people came to a meeting in the common room of Vancouver School of Theology, where I was studying at the time. And we decided that we would take up this issue of Trident. We would take it up as an experiment in nonviolence, and that would have to include dealing with those demons that were inside us, the landmines in our spirits. We called them the Trident within. And they had to do with things like consumerism and sexism and racism and all of the isms that we're so familiar with. We had a community that met once a month for years. And we had an education session on one of those issues. The kids had their own community. We had little kids then. And we would plan actions of all kinds around the Trident submarine: education, resistance, civil disobedience, what have you. And we tried to do it all in a way that invited people to look at the issue with us, not that judged them, but that invited them into a problem that we were trying to solve, that we were part of. It was out of that commitment that Ground Zero was born, because we realized, after organizing many demonstrations in Kitsap County and being arrested and going to trial and then to jail, that the people in the county looked on us as their enemies, because most of us were not from the county, and we came in and told them that their jobs were wrong, and they were very afraid that they would lose their jobs. So we decided, well, we need to get to know the people in the county, and they need to get to know us. And so we began, first we had a Bangor summer, we called it, like Mississippi summer, where people came and camped out, and we would leaflet the base and commit civil disobedience and talk to people. And then we got the idea of, well, if we had a piece of the rock, we would we would not have to worry about getting kicked off our property, for one thing. So we raised money and bought the 3.8 acres that Art was talking about that share the common fence with the base, which made the base very nervous for a while, because that was our civil disobedience, usually was climbing the fence to go into the base. But what we did at that point was we tried to make friends, and we would go, Jim went along Clear Creek Road where the house was with muffins to introduce us to the neighbors. And some of them were friendly and some of them set dogs on him. It just depended. And over time, Ground Zero has built good relationships in the county, not by not resisting. We continued to be arrested. We continued to leaflet the base. People went to jail. There was a plowshares action there a number of years ago. And there are still civil disobedience actions going on at Ground Zero now. But the difference is that one of the main spokespersons for Ground Zero at this point is a man named Tom Rogers. Tom Rogers was the captain of the Navy submarine that guided the Trident when it came into, for the first time, when it came into Puget Sound. They picked it up at the foot of Latin America, I think, and guided it all the way up to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, where it came down into Puget Sound, or into the Hood Canal. Tom Rogers captained that submarine. That was in what, 81, I think. And now 82. Tom Rogers is now a spokesperson for Ground Zero, one of the major people. We could tell a lot of stories like that. Archbishop Hunthausen is another one who got to know us by visiting us in jail, and having long discussions and bringing his diocesan people out to Ground Zero for retreats where they would listen. They would sit in our leaky dome and listen to facts about nuclear weapons and theology about nonviolence. I remember very well the Arch standing under a drip with his prayer book, trying to lead the prayers and stay dry at the same time. It was all done, though, on relationships. It was done on a shoestring, and it was done on relationships, which is a good Catholic worker tradition for those of you who are involved in the Catholic worker. We came here just to finish this up and hand it over to Jim. Bob Aldridge has been involved in the Trident campaign ever since. He's in his 90s now and is still writing books about nonviolence and explaining nuclear weapons to us. But when the nuclear train began to move, carrying nuclear warheads from Pantex in Amarillo, Texas, first out to the Trident base, we organized a community called the Agape Community, based on the love of God, where people would go all along the tracks and vigil and commit civil disobedience to stop the trains. And that went on for a number of years. Many friendships built out of that transnational community, and the train began to go east instead of west because the Kings Bay Trident base was about to open up, where the Kings Bay Plowshares acted not long ago. So people were beginning to organize around the Trident coming east, but there weren't as many nonviolent, anti-nuclear activists in the east as there were in the Pacific Northwest. So Jim and I moved in 1989 here, where we still live 70 feet from those tracks where the trains came through. And we began to organize, waiting for the first nuclear train. We waited for 2 years with people all ready to go and demonstrate. And then we discovered through the Freedom of Information Act that the government wasn't shipping the weapons on trains anymore because there was too much protest. So we were so successful that our move was kind of deflated. And that was when we had the idea of opening a Catholic worker house. And so we've done similar things in a different theater, I guess you could say. Since then, we've been trying to give hospitality to people who are homeless and build relationships here in Birmingham. We've done work, we do work around the death penalty We still vigil for peace every week, and that's been kind of transformational. We started right after 9/11, and we've done it at least once a week ever since, usually twice a week, and in very hostile territory at first, and now very friendly. And I'm going to stop because I'm over time here. What?
Just trying to figure out.
How much more time do we have? I think that's the question.
Let's go for about 10 minutes, Jim. Is that okay?
It's fine. We learned a great deal from Archbishop Hunthausen, and Art was citing some of his words. I think the amazing thing about his character, which inspired a huge widening of the movement that we were involved in, and the wider nonviolence movement against resistance to nuclear weapons. It's great inspiring thing about him was his understanding what love of enemies means in relation to everybody, no exceptions whatsoever. And when it came to the people on the other side of the fence at Bangor in the Trident submarine base, when Archbishop Hunthausen became a part of the campaign, well, I'll give one example of the way in which things began to be transformed. We leafleted every week, several times actually, to different bases in the Kitsap County. And our leafleting, we felt, was as important in its own way as our acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. Well, why is that? Well, because of the whole attitude of respect and of relationship, which Shelley was stressing, and which was it in terms of Archbishop Hunthausen. He said very prophetic things because he learned them, because he was a great pastor. He learned things from everybody, and he learned things from ground zero. And they became his. I mean, when he said words like Art was saying, all of that was Archbishop Hunthausen at the same time as he was a totally compassionate and pastoral person. So we would, when I was leafleting one day at the main gate of the base, a car stopped to get a leaflet, and the person looked up at me and said, "May I have dinner with you?" That was an unusual request. And I said, of course. And I always have a little notebook in my pocket. I scribbled our phone number on, and he came a few days later. He came over for dinner, and that man happened to be the Catholic chaplain of the Trident base, and he had Archbishop Hunthausen when he gave that speech at the Lutheran conference, where he said he was considering refusing to pay his taxes, and where he identified Trident as the Auschwitz to Puget Sound, and created all kinds of turmoil in the church and in the community and in the state. That speech he sent to every pastor in the diocese. So that meant the commanding or the chaplain of the Trident base. So that man, when he came to dinner with us, when he walked up our steps to this house beside the Trident tracks and the fence of the base, he sat down, and he looked up at us, and the first sentence he said was, "What does it mean to be the chaplain of the Auschwitz of Puget Sound?" That's the kind of thing that Archbishop Hunthausen was bringing home constantly, because he was a pastor who was a prophet. He was both. And he came over to the people of Kitsap County, enormous numbers of which were working on the Trident base or one of the related bases. He went to each of the parishes, and he didn't say those particular words. They all knew those words. They knew them much too well. He listened. He listened and responded to everything they said. And they said some horrifying things in terms of who he was in relation to them. And he just absorbed it and smiled. And he didn't bow as the Buddhists did. He smiled, and he respected those people profoundly, and they got it. They got it. And that created a huge crisis, both in the base, in the Pacific Northwest, and across the country, as people picked up on Archbishop Hunthausen. He went around and he didn't have to say a lot more than he'd already said, because he lived what he said. He said in his speech that particular day that Art was citing, that he was considering, he had a vision. I'll tell you what his vision was. I'll just describe it. He said his vision was, let's see here. Well, I can't find it in the speech. His vision was, he envisioned as many as 500,000 people in the Pacific Northwest refusing to pay their income taxes. He said this in his speech. He said, we can't just talk about these things. He's basically saying, what is this kind of thing that happens every April? It's like an April Fool's joke on April 15th. All of us who are saying no to nuclear arms in that context are supporting it. we're providing the money to fund the nuclear arms every April 15th. He said, well, look, I'm just going to be kind of practical. He says, why don't we stop doing that? And he said he was considering doing it. So then, of course, people asked him in the next 6 months, well, have you decided whether you're going to do it or not? And 6 months later, he then said, yes, I'm going to refuse to pay 50% of my taxes. And of course, they garnished his wages and so forth. That drew down upon him the condemnation of the United States government very personally. The Secretary of the Navy denounced him. and President Reagan began to consult with the Pope.
JP2.
JP2, Pope John Paul II, as to how to deal with that man. And Archbishop Hunthausen, he not only risked the cross, he lost his pastorate for his prophetic vision. So there's a pastor who's called to be a prophet just because he sees where he's at. Where is he? Where am I? Where are we? Where are all of us? And he saw in the Pacific Northwest, the Trident base in the center of his diocese, he could not remain silent any more than Martin Luther King could about the Vietnam War. Cannot remain silent. He could not remain silent as a pastor. He became a prophet, and he lost it all in terms of the thing he loved most, which was being the Archbishop of Seattle, because he could do so many things to help so many people, but he had to be the prophet. And Rome, then investigated him and appointed a coadjutor bishop who confined his powers, and he finally didn't have that kind of power any longer. That's the risk of the cross. And it's just recognizing where we are. Well, all of us are in precisely the same position as Archbishop Hunthausen in terms of what he recognized as the risk of the cross, in terms of his refusing to pay his income tax. So that's something, we might all want to consider. If we are resisting nuclear weapons, And when April 15th comes, or for that matter, each paycheck, if we cooperate with the process of funding the nuclear weapons, are we risking the cross? It's a good question. And I'll stop there.
Jim and Shelley, thank you so much. Everybody, please remember what they have both shared as we continue on in our next several sessions. Session 5 is going to be all about action. What actions are we going to be able to take personally and together? So Jim and Shelley, we can't thank you enough for everything that you've shared. And from the bottom of our hearts, we express our gratitude. Thank you so much. Nick is now going to introduce the next segment of our session.
Hi, everybody. So thank you. I want to add my thanks, Jim and Shelley, for reminding us what discipleship looks like. What we have next is a video presentation by Joe Gerson. He wanted to be here, but he's attending a conference in Barcelona. Just very briefly, Joe is the executive director of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He's also vice president of the International Peace Bureau, and he's the author of Empire and the Bomb: How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World. He's also the author of a brief timeline of how that happens, which is on page 77 of The Risk of the Cross. That's in the appendix that we highlight as relevant for this session. And right now I will get started on the video. So let's see. I don't know if I can make that any larger. Oh, there we go.
Good evening, friends. I'm sorry to be joining you via video, but it was the only way that I can make my small contribution tonight to Art's important work. So please bear with me if you will. I'm going to kind of run through a PowerPoint as we go here. I've been very fortunate to, in some ways, have been a student of Dan Ellsberg's over the years. And as you may know, Dan was one of the principal designers of the Kennedy era nuclear warfighting doctrine. And among other things, he has explained that, in fact, the last time the U.S. used nuclear weapons was not Nagasaki, but in fact, during many international crises and wars, the U.S. has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear attacks, in the same way that an armed robber uses his gun in the midst of an armed robbery. Whether or not the trigger is pulled or not, the gun has been used. Most of us think that somehow the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war against Japan, but in fact, this wasn't true. As leading military officers and the Secretary of State at the time understood, was already trying to surrender on terms that the U.S. eventually accepted after Japan surrendered, not before. And the attacks were initiated to bring the war to an immediate halt in order to avoid having to share influence with the Soviet Union in Manchuria, northern China, and Korea, goals that were not met. Kind of deconstructing testimony given by former U.S. Secretary of Defense Brown, Noam Chomsky explains to us that the U.S. has used its nuclear weapons, its arsenal, its threats, in order to ensure that other nations will not come to the defense of countries that we are determined to attack. And this is called deterrence. You'll see a list in a minute here, which will give you a deeper understanding of this. Again, the belief has been broad that the nuclear arsenal exists to deter nuclear attack against the United States. And since the Soviet Union created something like nuclear parity in the 1970s, this has been part of the truth, but not the whole truth. But over time, as the Bush administration's initial draft of its defense policy guidance indicated, the real purpose, the thing to be deterred, is actions that are inimical to what the US government says are its interests, meaning to, for example, ensure our control over the Middle East or the Asia Pacific, making sure that we can get our oil from under their sands. This is a list of US Cold War uses of nuclear threats, preparations for nuclear war, nuclear blackmail in relationship to the Middle East, making sure the US could control the geopolitical center of what was then the world struggle for power. As early as 1946, before the Russians had the nuclear weapon, Truman made the threat, basically demanded that Soviet Union evacuate from Iran, which is occupied during World War II with US approval, within 48 hours. Under that threat, it began within 24. On this list, the one that in some ways was most immediate to me was 1973, when Nixon, in the last stages of the Watergate crisis, was totally drunk, unable to really to do much in terms of US policy. And Kissinger was running US foreign and military policy during the 1973 war. There had been a ceasefire declared, but Kissinger had given Golda Meir the green light to violate that ceasefire, and the Egyptian Third Army was in danger of being totally annihilated. So Sadat of Egypt sent a message that the following day he'd asked the UN to authorize both the US and the Soviets to send troops in to protect the Third Army. Kissinger moved quickly, put US forces on alert, basically to warn the Soviets not to send its troops. At the same time, he ordered Golda Meir to finally respect the ceasefire. And this has been sort of a model of paradigm that has been followed frequently. We think of the Cold War as being principally in Europe, principally in relationship to Germany. But as you'll see here, most Cold War threats were made in relationship to maintaining US dominance in Asia, sometimes in ways that didn't succeed. So you had the repeated threats during the Korean War. You had the Eisenhower threat when he came to power, basically threatening the Chinese that if they didn't accept US terms, we would attack them. Deal was made, and Nixon, in fact, took this as the model for what was called the madman theory. That the US president was mad enough to initiate nuclear war. And that basically was the model that he used for his 1969 November ultimatum, which you can read more. The US threatened nuclear attacks 4 times in relationship to, in most cases, prepared nuclear attacks, at least 4 times during the Vietnam War. And China got its fair share of threats as well. The nuclear dangers didn't end with the Cold War. Among them, we've had numerous simulated nuclear attacks against North Korea and Trump's fire and fury threat, plus the exchange of threats by the US and Russia during the earlier stages of the Ukraine war and Russia's seizure of Crimea. Here's a list of the post-Cold War nuclear threats by the United States. Perhaps most significant, 1991, when in the run-up to the first Gulf War, Bush, Quayle, Cheney, and British Prime Minister Major all threatened Iraq with nuclear attack should he attack US forces, NATO forces that were gathering in Kuwait to push the Iraqis back. I had calls related to Westover Air Force Base here in Massachusetts, where I was being told that nuclear weapons were being moved through that base to the Middle East for possible use. 9/11, when there was total chaos and uncertainty in Washington, Bush and Cheney moved to a nuclear alert. And as you'll see, as I mentioned, we had both the Ukraine war and fire and fury. The United States has not been the only country to make such threats, although it's done it many, many more times than other countries. But here is the list. Every other nuclear power has done it at least once. We tend to think that in the middle of a major crisis that the president has total control over the US military. But we learned during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or actually after it, that wasn't the case during that crisis. We know that political and nationalist forces can lead presidents to take irrational action. Kennedy had told his brother that if he hadn't moved to the embargo and the threat of invading Cuba, which would have resulted in we wouldn't be here. That would have been a catastrophic nuclear war. That if he hadn't done that, he would have been impeached. We had numerous cases of military insubordination during the crisis, including one general secretly ratcheting up the level of the nuclear threat in a way that DEFCON alert, in ways that the Soviets could see, but Americans couldn't, would have led to an absolutely tragic Russian response. Intelligence failures then and now. I mean, we know from Afghanistan that the military intelligence is not always intelligent. And again, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, an order was sent to US forces in Okinawa to launch nuclear weapons against China. But fortunately, the commanding officer thought better of that order and didn't follow it. At the moment, we're in preparations. There's a movement to deploy air-launched cruise missiles to the Pacific, basically to overcome China's increasing ability to deny military access, naval access in the Western Pacific. And this, with our aircraft carriers increasingly in jeopardy, and with the movement in this direction, this is driving the Chinese to think about increasing the size of their arsenal to maintain deterrence. Most of us are unaware of the nuclear threats related to Russia. I mean, we have to be grateful for the strategic stability talks that are going on now, but most people are unaware of the provocative military exercises going on in the Baltic and Black Seas, where an incident could all too easily escalate into a nuclear confrontation. The same applies to the South China Sea, where we have provocative military exercises and the recent US, Australia, UK agreement. Most of the rest of the world sees an apartheid system, a system with the nuclear haves and the nuclear have-nots. And this has led to deep criticism. It drives nuclear weapons proliferation. But on the other side, it has also driven the negotiations for the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This coming spring, there'll be a meeting of the more than 50 countries that have signed and ratified that treaty, which is designed to move us toward nuclear disarmament. I want to celebrate here Joseph Rotblat. He was the one senior scientist in the Manhattan Project who resigned as a matter of principle or moral considerations, became the head of Pugwash and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was very clear that humanity faces a stark choice. We can either completely eliminate our nuclear arsenals or we'll see their global proliferation in the wars that follow. Why? Because no nation won't tolerate what it perceives to be an unjust hierarchy of terror. Concluding here, these are two books that you might find helpful. My book goes into deep detail about this history that I've skimmed across, and Fred Kaplan's new book is also very helpful as well. Thank you for your attention. Art, you do great work, and I wish you all the best this evening.